About the author. Shlomo Sand is a professor of history at Tel Aviv University in Israel and once taught at the École Supérieure des Sciences Sociales in France. Born in Linz, Austria in 1946, he was a Polish Jew who survived the Holocaust. Shlomo is committed to the research fields of nationalism, French intellectual history, film history, etc. His books, The Invention of the Jewish People, From Holy Land to Homeland Land of Israel, and How I Stopped Being a Jew, are called the fictional trilogy, causing sensation and controversy in Israel and Western academic circles. About this book, Shlomo's parents were Polish Jews, but they both gave up Judaism and believed in communism, which had a direct impact on Shlomo. As Shlomo grew up, he gradually developed a hostile stance towards Zionism, an ideology that emphasized that Israel was a Jewish state and that the Palestinians who originally lived on this land must be suppressed and excluded. Shlomo believes that this attitude not only goes against justice and the direction of history, but is also the source of instability in the Middle East. After he taught at a university, he developed sympathy for Palestinian students who did not have Israeli citizenship. That's why I wrote a book like this, to refute the lies of official ideology. Core content. The author points out that the so-called Jewish nation is a false concept and is made up. The Jews did not become a nation from the time mentioned in the Hebrew Bible, as is generally believed. All nations are narratives given by later generations to serve current purposes. When the Zionist movement needed to mobilize Jews everywhere to go to Palestine, they created this narrative and declared it a return to the homeland. But this is a fabricated myth. There was no such thing as Jewish exile at the beginning, so naturally there is no return. As a result, they simply occupied Palestinian land. In fact, on the contrary, Palestinians are the true descendants of the Jewish ancestors of this land. Preface. Hello and welcome to listening to this book every day. The work for you to interpret in this issue is The Invention of the Jewish People. The author, Shlomo Sand, points out in this book that the so-called Jewish nation is actually a pseudo-concept and a fiction. The Jews are not mentioned in the Hebrew Bible. As is generally believed, it has become a nation since then. On what grounds does the author put forward such a view? This is the focus of our interpretation of this issue. When we talk about Israel, we usually say that it is a Jewish country. When we talk about Jews, we think of them as smart, shrewd, pious, rich, and hard-working. Our impression of this nation is basically good. Many people will feel that the Jewish nation has a long history that spans thousands of years, especially when we understand that the Jews have been driven out of the land where their ancestors settled since AD 70 and have never had their own country since. When we can only live as sojourns among other ethnic groups, often being chased back and forth and forced to wander around, we may feel even more that the success of the Jewish nation today and the existence of the country Israel today are simply a very inspiring story. You must know that for 2,000 years, without their own land and homeland, any other nation would have perished long ago. However, the Jews have been able to maintain their own national characteristics. Their patience, tenacity, and piety are really amazing. But if someone told you that the Jews were not actually a nation at all, and that their rise, fall, and wandering history over the past 2,000 years were all made up by someone for some purpose, would you be surprised? This is the core idea of the book I am going to talk about, The Invention of the Jewish People. The author of this book is Shlomo, a professor and historian at Tel Aviv University in Israel. This book was published in 2008. It is his first academic work published after more than 30 years of research and thinking. It attracted international attention as soon as it came out and has been translated into more than 20 languages. Shlomo was widely praised for his intellectual courage and insight, and for this, of course, he was considered by many to be an enemy of Israel. Shlomo is an Israeli citizen, has a stable teaching position, and has no conflict of interest with Israeli officials. So why did he write such a book? This has to start with his family environment. Shlomo's parents were Polish Jews, but they both gave up Judaism and believed in communism, which had a direct impact on Shlomo. As Shlomo grew up, he gradually developed a hostile stance towards Israel's official ideology, which is Zionism. This ideology emphasizes that Israel is a Jewish state and must suppress and exclude the Palestinians who originally lived in this land. Shlomo believes that this attitude not only goes against justice and the direction of history, but is also the source of instability in the Middle East. After he taught at a university, he developed sympathy for Palestinian students who did not have Israeli citizenship. That's why I wrote a book like this to refute the lies of official ideology. After The Invention of the Jewish People, Shlomo also published a book, How I Stopped Being a Jew, in which he declared, "Because I couldn't stand the fictitious nationality imposed on me by Israeli law, it was even more difficult to stand its role in the world. I am willing to give up being a Jew and no longer consider myself a Jew in front of other people who claim to be members of the club of God's chosen people." It can be said that he actually wrote The Invention of the Jewish People for the purpose of anti-Zionism. Later, when he gave up his Jewish identity, he further strengthened his attitude of completely dissolving Jewishness and envisioned a secular, non-exclusive Israeli identity that transcends Zionism. Next, I will explain the core content of this book in detail from 3 aspects. Let's follow Shlomo's research to see who invented the myth of the Jewish nation, why they invented it, and what results this fiction achieved. Part 1. Let's look at the first question first. What makes us mistakenly think that the Jews are a nation? It's the Bible, specifically the Jewish Bible, commonly known as the Hebrew Bible. Jews have grown up reading the Hebrew Bible for generations. This book begins with God's creation of the world. The Jewish people are said to have originated from the ancestral figure Abraham, who gave birth to Isaac, and Isaac gave birth to Jacob. Jacob, in turn, had Joseph, and through this lineage, a nation gradually emerged. Later, Moses led the Jewish people out of Egypt and back to the land of Canaan on the eastern coast of the Mediterranean. By this time, the Jewish people had become the chosen people of God and had entered into a covenant with God, adhering to the laws given by God. In subsequent history, the Jewish people established their own nation centered around Jerusalem. They had notable kings like David and Solomon, but later experienced division and decline. Ancient Jews were also exiled from their homeland at times, but returned gradually. However, in the year 70 AD, the Romans suppressed their resistance and exiled them once again to other regions. For almost 2,000 years, the Jewish people did not truly return to their ancestral homeland. This land, known as Judea in the Bible, was later given a name that is familiar to us today, Palestine. From this, it can be seen that according to the content of the Hebrew Bible, the Jewish people originated from where, what they did in their early years, how they flourished, how they declined, and how they were later exiled can all be traced in a clear line. As long as there is such a clear historical record, the existence of this nation is without a doubt. However, the people who wrote history did so either during the events themselves or after the events occurred. The answer is quite clear that history can only be written by later generations. Therefore, so-called history inevitably contains a storytelling nature and often includes some elements of fiction. Next, Shlomo wants us to think using common sense. According to the records of the Hebrew Bible, the early Jewish people were in the process of transitioning from nomadic tribes to settled agricultural societies. What were they like? The majority of these people, whether shepherds or farmers, had a very low level of education, and in fact, they had little knowledge. Their actions were dictated by their leaders, and they might not even share a common language with their leaders. A farmer who spent their life working the land might never have the chance to see what a king looked like. Would they know that they were part of a nation? In the introduction, Shlomo quotes the following statement: "A nation is a group of people united by a common false belief in their ancestry and a common dislike of their neighbors." While this statement may sound extreme, Sand's intention is to tell us that the concept of a nation is often manufactured afterward with the purpose of creating emotional bonds among a group of people, making each member feel that they share a common ancestry with others, leading to a sense of belonging and a willingness to stay in the group and work for it. So, if the Jewish people of that time were far from being a nation, how did they come together? Shlomo says that it was because they shared the same religion, Judaism. 2,000 or 3,000 years ago, the power of religion was the strongest, and it was the religious leaders of Judaism who were relatively more cultured, intelligent, and had the strongest language skills. They would spread and develop a sense of us among the masses, telling everyone that they were a community. Religious beliefs made everyone within the group believe in the same God, but they might not necessarily know their tribal ancestors or their kings. Part 2. Since the Hebrew Bible has obvious storytelling characteristics, why is it regarded as the true history of the Jews and then a fictional Jewish nation? This is the second core question we want to ask. Why is there such fiction? Shlomo explains that for most of the past 2 millennia, very few people regarded the Hebrew Bible as a completely and purely historical text. Even among Jewish readers and scholars, the Hebrew Bible was seen as a religious text containing numerous myths rather than a strict historical account. However, in the latter half of the 19th century, some Jewish intellectual elites in Europe believed that Jews had to end their stateless existence or they would inevitably face extinction. These intellectuals initiated a movement known as Jewish Zionism, the aim of which was to mobilize Jews worldwide to find a piece of land and establish a nation. Later, this place was found in Palestine. According to the description in the Hebrew Bible, Palestine is the place where the Jewish nation emerged, lived, established its own country, and created a glorious history more than 2,000 to 3,000 years ago. In the Bible, the name of this land is Judea. In this way, if what is said in the Hebrew Bible is true, then when the Jews want to go to this place, they can use the banner of returning to the land of their ancestors, which seems justified and can greatly arouse the enthusiasm of the Jews. But the more important point is that, since Palestine is not an empty land and Palestinians live there, if the Jews want to come over now, it will be difficult to avoid conflicts with the Palestinians. Therefore, recognizing Palestine as the land of the Jewish ancestors is very important to the Jews. As said, it is really necessary. The Zionists did a lot of work to tell those influential figures in international politics at that time that Palestine was indeed the land of their ancestors, and that their ancestors were expelled from this land by the Romans in 70 AD. They were completely exiled from the land and have never returned on a large scale since then. They can only yearn for their hometown yearningly from generation to generation, constantly remembering the great Jerusalem created by their ancestors. The history of 70 AD is not a pure story, it is recorded. The main basis is the book Jewish Wars, written by the Jewish historian Josephus in the 1st century AD. However, Shlomo pointed out that although the Romans' war to suppress the Jews did occur in 70 AD, the ancient Jews were exiled from the land of their ancestors, which is another man-made myth. The concept of exile, like the concept of Jewish nation, is also fictitious, since the Romans never exiled all conquered peoples. Shlomo gave 3 reasons for this. First of all, given the productivity and production levels of that era, it was unprofitable for the rulers to exile all the conquered people and greatly reduce the farming and taxing population. Secondly, the Roman rulers had the conditions to brutally suppress the rebels, but they lacked the conditions to exile all the conquered people because they did not have the trucks, trains, or large warships that the modern world can use. Also, Josephus's The Jewish Wars, as historical material, has many doubts. Josephus lived 2,000 years ago and was a survivor when the Jews were suppressed by the Romans. He later lived in the Roman Empire. So how did he understand the overall situation of the Jews at that time? Many of his statistics are exaggerated. For example, Josephus said that 1 million people in Jerusalem were killed by the Romans at that time. Shlomo pointed out that this was impossible. He quoted archaeological data to show that the residents of Jerusalem at that time were only 60,000 to 70,000. Most importantly, even Josephus, who wrote so passionately about the horrors of Jewish suppression, did not mention that the Romans exiled the Jews. Therefore, the concept of exile is also fictitious, and its purpose is to prove that the Jews have historical rights to the Palestinian area and to prove that their return is justifiable. After exposing the above two fictions, Shlomo goes on to answer an important question. If the Jews were not exiled and driven away completely, then where were the Jews who lived in the land of their ancestors 2,000 years ago? This brings us back to Judaism. As mentioned before, the Jewish nation does not exist, but Judaism does. As long as anyone believes in this religion, he becomes a Jew. Therefore, Shlomo cited numerous data points to prove that the Jews at that time were not driven to other places, but in order to survive, they would convert to other religions. In the 300s to 400s AD, Christianity was on the rise and eventually became the state religion of the Byzantine Empire. So some Jews converted to Christianity. Later, another major change occurred in human history. In the 7th century AD, Islam emerged on the Arabian Peninsula. From 638 AD to 643 AD, the Islamic army occupied Palestine. What happened then? Shlomo said that because Jews were treated more tolerantly under the influence of Islam than in the past, Jews in Palestine converted to Islam on a large scale. This conclusion is bound to cause a sensation. As we all know, in today's Middle East, the relationship between Jewish Israel and surrounding Islamic countries has always been tense. In the 70 years since the founding of Israel, two sides have fought several major wars, and small conflicts have continued. And now Shlomo concludes that historically, Jews have converted to Islam, which many people cannot emotionally accept. So who are the descendants of these Jews who converted to Islam? Shlomo goes on to make a startling inference, saying that they are the Palestinians of today. Shlomo listed the research results of some scholars, which proved that the Palestinians' spoken language preserved a large number of biblical terms and the place names of their mountain villages. Mountains, streams, springs, valleys, and hills all came from the Bible, which proved that they have close cultural ties with ancient Jews. If the Palestinian area is the land of the Jewish ancestors, then Palestinians are the legitimate descendants of these ancestors. However, the reality is quite the opposite. The Zionist movement, from the very beginning, adopted an attitude of disregard towards the Palestinian people, emphasizing their own right to return. In 1948, when Israel was established, it completely sacrificed the interests of the Palestinian people. Their land was occupied, their houses were demolished, and they could only live in areas designated by the Jewish population or work for Jewish people. From the establishment of Israel until today, the vast majority of Palestinians remain second-class citizens, unable to obtain Israeli citizenship. Very few can rise to the upper echelons of society, let alone assimilate into the Jewish community. Indeed, the Israeli official ideology often downplays or ignores the presence of Palestinians within their borders and emphasizes Israel as a Jewish state. When discussing the situation of the indigenous Palestinian population in 1948, the Israeli government may argue that they are not a distinct nation but rather scattered Arab peasants. In contrast, they assert that Jewish people have always been a continuous nation with historical rights to the land. At this point, let's briefly summarize the content of the second part. Shlomo Sand's argument suggests that the claims Jews are a people with a long history, and, in 70 AD, the ancient Jews were exiled from Judea by the Romans and were never able to return to their homeland, are two myths deliberately created by Zionist proponents. The purpose of these myths was to provide a strong basis for Jews to establish a state in Palestine and gain international support. Sand argues that in reality, Jews did not have a legitimate right to return, but rather colonized Palestine. The State of Israel was established on the basis of colonizing the Palestinian people. Part 3. Next, Shlomo has to answer another question. Who were the Jewish colonists who came to Palestine? Are they Jewish? Shlomo's answer is, they are Jews, but they are not descendants of the so-called Jewish ancestors. They come from somewhere else. As mentioned before, religious belief is a personal choice, and one can convert or give up. Jews living in Palestine once abandoned Judaism and converted to Islam, and people living elsewhere could also convert to Judaism and become Jews. Shlomo confirmed the fact that for a long time before 70 AD, outside the area that was later called Palestine, there used to be a large number of Jewish groups, and some even formed countries. There is a lot of historical data and archaeological evidence to prove it. So, were they Jews exiled from Palestine? Shlomo said, no, they were formed by people from those places converting to Judaism. Today, Judaism does not preach and generally does not welcome outside converts. However, during the 400 years from the 2nd century BC to the 2nd century AD, Judaism was actively expanding outward. We know that Judaism is the first monotheistic religion in history, which means belief in only one supreme God. It cannot tolerate polytheistic beliefs, so people who believe in Judaism will spread it and tell others that they can only believe in one God and that other gods are false or evil, so they should convert to Judaism. The process of preaching has the barbaric flavor of ancient society and is coercive. If the preacher does not obey, he may face the danger of being expelled. The existence of the Jews was therefore the result of missionary work, not of exile. Shlomo cited historical data to prove that this trend of Jewish missionary work continued until the early 4th century AD and did not stop. Throughout this argument, Shlomo not only relies on various previous research materials, but also uses common sense extensively. He repeatedly reminds readers not to overestimate the mobility of people in ancient times. People back then did not have the transportation and ease of travel that we have today. It was challenging for them to settle down in a new place, and they would not easily abandon their homeland. So, if converting or changing their religious affiliation could help them stabilize and survive, they would likely choose to do so. Based on this common sense, Shlomo convinced readers that Jews did not wander on a large scale, but that Judaism would spread and create new Jews in various places. And those Jews who returned to their homeland were the result of the spread of Judaism. Shlomo Sand informs us that the Jewish people who returned to their homeland primarily came from Eastern Europe. In the early 20th century, Eastern European Jews formed a large community with a common language and were on the verge of becoming a distinct ethnic group. According to existing historical records from the 16th and 17th centuries until the 1930s, the population of Eastern European Jews continued to grow, and their distribution became more concentrated. In places like Russia, Poland, Ukraine, Romania, Lithuania, and Latvia, Jewish communities grew larger and gained influence in their respective areas. Their numbers far exceeded those of Jews living elsewhere. In the 18th century, for example, Poland alone had 750,000 Jews, while in cities like Hamburg, London, and Paris, there were only a little over 3,000 Jews in total. Why does this happen? Why do Jews gather in Eastern Europe? As mentioned earlier, Jews formed their identity through the practice of Judaism. Shlomo Sand cites various sources and arguments to suggest that in the 8th century, there was a Khazar kingdom in Central Asia which adopted Judaism as its official religion, thereby creating the Khazar Jews. This kingdom existed between the 8th and 12th centuries in the region between the Caspian Sea and the Black Sea. When the Khazar kingdom disappeared, Khazar Jews dispersed to nearby Eastern Europe and gathered there. Although the Khazar kingdom didn't leave precise historical records, Shlomo argues that acknowledging the existence of the Khazar kingdom is essential to explain why there were so many Jews in Eastern Europe. Shlomo points out that this Jewish community in Eastern Europe came close to forming a distinct nation. They had developed social classes, division of labor, and rudimentary political structures. They had their everyday cultural life, and most importantly, they had a common language known as Yiddish, which is a key marker of nationhood because a shared language allows a group to form a cohesive community through seamless communication. However, the process of forming a nation was disrupted due to the rise of Nazi Germany and the Holocaust, which had devastating consequences for the Eastern European Jewish communities and their unique identity. Shlomo's conclusion makes it clear that the myth of the Jewish nation was constructed, and it served a specific purpose. The Zionist movement used this myth to establish Israel and promote the belief in an ancient nation returning to its homeland. In reality, there was no unchanging, fixed Jewish nation that persisted through 2 millennia, unwavering in faith and ready to return to their ancestral land to establish a state. This story may sound inspiring, but it's merely a narrative. In his book, Shlomo often uses an affirming tone to praise the leaders of the Zionist movement. He acknowledges their intellectual prowess, decisiveness, and their ability to shrewdly manipulate circumstances to achieve their goals. However, he insists that this doesn't make the constructed narrative true. The fact remains that the Zionist movement utilized a constructed historical narrative to establish an ideology that allowed them to colonize Palestine and suppress the Palestinian people. According to this ideology, the Palestinian people can be disregarded as they don't belong there, and their right to existence is not a concern for the Jewish people. In response, Shlomo asks a straightforward question. If Jewish people, after an absence of 2,000 years, still have the right to reclaim their ancestral land, then shouldn't the Palestinian people, who have lived there for 12 centuries, be entitled to something as well? However, Shlomo is not a radical scholar. He doesn't advocate for Jews to leave the land, dissolve the state, or provoke hatred against their own country or people. Instead, he suggests that Israel's best course of action is to let go of the rigid concept of Jewishness that it has long held and, in doing so, allow the Palestinian people to identify with Israel. He points to historical examples where various occupations and conquests left behind deep-seated grievances and hatred, and the resolution required both sides to use reason and wisdom. For instance, the United States illegally took land from Native Americans during its founding. But this doesn't mean the United States should cease to exist. Similarly, the Norman conquest of England from the European continent 1,000 years ago did not lead to demands for the Normans to be expelled. Present-day Israel, too, emerged through conflict and conquest, and it has made significant achievements and invested efforts in the land. Instead of diminishing or nullifying these accomplishments, Shlomo suggests that Israel should open its heart to acknowledge and embrace the Palestinian people whom it has intentionally overlooked and feared in the past. In Shlomo's view, relinquishing the rigid concept of Jewishness and ceasing to insist on Israel as the Israel of the Jews would benefit both the Palestinian people and the Jewish people. Shlomo's conclusions have sparked significant controversy in his home country of Israel. The country's religious conservative factions are powerful and intolerant of any questioning of the authenticity of the Hebrew Bible. They are even less likely to accept the idea of equality between Jewish and Palestinian people. They perceive Sand as a traitor, a naive, overly sympathetic left-wing intellectual, and they focus on his arguments as an attempt to undermine the foundations of their beliefs. Sand openly acknowledges that he is an Israeli himself and has no intention of challenging the Israeli government or inciting hatred against his own country or people. His main motivation for writing the book is a sense of injustice. He has witnessed the hardships of his Palestinian students and felt their sense of displacement. This country does not recognize them as equal citizens alongside the Jewish people and as people carrying the Palestinian identity. They find it difficult to relocate to other countries. They feel inferior in the presence of their Jewish peers because of their identity, but they also struggle to find a way out of that sense of inferiority. Sand questions why Jewish people can live comfortably in the United States while Palestinian people cannot naturally reside in Israel. Summary. In summary, the core argument of the book by Shlomo Sand is that the concept of the Jewish nation is a pseudo-concept and a construct. He argues that Jews did not become a nation in the sense commonly believed from the times described in the Hebrew Bible. He contends that all nations are narratives constructed by later generations to serve contemporary purposes. When the Zionist movement needed to mobilize Jews from various regions to move to Palestine, they created this narrative and claimed it was a return to the homeland. However, according to Sand, this was a fabricated myth because Jews were not in exile to begin with, so there was no actual return. Instead, they occupied the land of the Palestinian people, while in reality, the Palestinians are the true descendants of the ancient Jews in that region.